This last section deals with South Asia, which is show you on a map here. It's the section that includes Pakistan, Bhutan, Nepal, the Himalaya mountain countries, then the gigantic India, Sri Lanka, which is the island, the Teardrop Island, the Maldives, which are these atoll little islands in the South Indian Ocean, which are North Indian Ocean, which are being flooded by sea level rise. And then finally, Bangladesh, flat as the floor, sediment-laden topography. So this is the Indian subcontinent. This is what we're going to work on this week. You can see I have a couple of readings. There's your homeworks, slides. There's YouTube videos. You should watch a couple of them. And then extra credit possibilities, including readings from Bangalore, Monsoon Wedding, if it's an extra credit there, Times of India, the diaspora, which is really crazy. You might hear this word with Jewish population and Indian population. Diaspora is the idea where there's a spreading out of people. The exodus, in terms of Jewish population, the exodus from East Africa and the Southwest Asia area, all over the world. New York, Los Angeles, London, Berlin, Russia, those areas. But South Asia also has a diaspora where there's so many people living in this region that people who do become more educated, they look for opportunities all over the planet, whether that's Australia, Singapore, Philippines, Persian Gulf, Europe, South Africa, North America, or the cities in South America. People go where there's job opportunities and better places for their family. So the diaspora that you hear about is talking about people leaving, and it's the largest one in the world. We'll pull that article up here. It's the largest one in the world because it's the largest population we're dealing with. Okay, so 15 million people with Indian descent live abroad. You can see there's the departure playing, cartoon and stuff like that. But where are they? This is from 2017, showing you the growth of where they are. And 2.3 million in the United States, 3.3 in the UAE, which is a tiny little country. But so that's where they are. Don't forget about Fiji. Fiji is all the way over here. There's a very large Indian population. And then Trinidad. Which one is it? Trinidad or Tobago? I forget. One of the two. It's a country together, but one island and different island. One of them is almost completely Indian descendant population, and the other one is almost completely African descendant population. And that's the one with the Mardi Gras, the Carnival, and the Indian population is the other island. So you have Pakistanis, Indians, Bangladeshis all over the world, okay? Just like we have the Chinese population all over, especially Southeast Asia and East Asia. We have the Indian one that stretches all over the world.
So going to Qatar, is that all the labor force there then?
Some of that is the labor force, some is Indian, okay? Going to Doha, Qatar, where they're doing the World Cup. A lot of those workers are coming from Bhutan and Nepal, which are the very poor countries up in the Himalayas, Bangladesh, and then the Philippines, Malaysia as well. But yeah, those are the folks that are going and building the football stadiums and the hotels all throughout the Persian Gulf here that are looked down upon as second-class citizens. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And some of them, it seems like they are in slavery because they're the businesses who hire them promise them one thing, and they get there, they see something else. And if you want to work there, they actually take your passport so you can't leave. It is very much sort of like slave labor. Yeah. So, yeah, there's all sorts of stories, especially with the World Cup coming to Qatar in 2022. There's all sorts of stadia that are being built by manual labor from the poorest parts of the world. That would be India, Pakistan, Nepal, this South Asia area. So great question, Shabria. So that is the information for this. Where is it? This week here coming up. This the solar lights video. It's a nice short video. Where is it? Thought I opened it up here somewhere.
Yeah,
Have you
I
seen that
have
one
lots
yet?
of problems with that video.
Oh, okay. See,
I just feel like that's not acceptable to like, they're marketing the wrong people. Like they should market more companies that will come in and help these people and give the
yeah.
lights for free instead of actually
Instead of
charging
5,
people
yeah.
who don't have money for them.
Yeah, they don't have, and I sort of was thinking the same thing when I was watching the video going, they're trying to sell it to these people who have barely anything?
Yeah, that didn't make sense to me.
No, but you know, there's a market out there somewhere, and then people will you know, put money together to make that payment.
But it's needed. I
It is
think that's
needed.
totally needed, and I think it's a great idea. It breaks my heart that it's going that way, though.
Yes, exactly. Yep. So that's just a little segment that I had up there, 339. But you could watch the whole video for extra credit and talk about that if you'd like to as well. Okay. Other extra credits you can see there. There's the Times of India story, the Economic Times that I asked for in the US. And this is from 2018, so that's somewhat recent. Eventually we'll pull it up. So, guess it's there. I don't know why it didn't come up completely, but it's there. It was there. I'll have to fix that one. So, one page. It should have been a lot more when I printed it. So anyway, here is your chapter 8, your free books. This is the is this the Dasher book? It looks like the same, you know, it's almost the same book. This is the Katie book, the Katie Finlayson book. Okay, it's really, really good. I was talking to a couple geographers on Friday and saying they use this as well, this book as well. It's a nice introduction to this area. Okay, you also have your iTunes if you want to, you know, travel and carpool and commute. The biggest gathering of the planet is a religious festival that is in India. So you have this playlist that I've set up. And before you start looking at going, oh my gosh, this is a long, long playlist, just watch the first 6, 7, 8 of them. You know, maybe not all of number 7 here. It's, you know, 55 minutes. But just get enough, watch, especially the short ones, to get an idea of what is going on here in this Kumbh Mela. It's a huge pilgrimage. It's like going to Rome or going to Jerusalem or Esquipulas or Lourdes. It's a huge religious event. And when you're watching these, please try and be like a geographer or an anthropologist. Step out of your skin and look at it from a non-biased perspective, because these folks are just as religious as you might be, but their religion is different than yours, just like yours is different than theirs. So it might seem strange to us, but it's their customs and their ways. It's just as strange for them to see us dressing in penguin suits and white princess dresses for weddings. Same idea. So we're strange to them, just as like this is sort of strange to us.
We really liked it. I put it on in the house for even my 4-year-old to see. And it's amazing that all of those people can come together and not fight. In my mind, that's like ridiculous.
Yeah, it's great. It's wonderful, and it's crazy, and it's a tourist trap, and it's a tourist environment. It's wonderful and terrible in all sorts of cool ways.
I would love to go there one day.
I would love to go there just to see that too. And one of the videos here, I'm not sure which one it is, they actually show, again, this is mostly Hindu and different sects of Hinduism, but they also show the Dalai Lama showing up, who is Buddhist. So, and I've also seen a video where they have an imam show up, which is Islam or Muslim folks. So it is a peaceful gathering of people, which is really cool to see, especially in a world that is more and more divided every year. And especially in a place like India, which is pulling hard to the right and extremism is taking over. It is just like the US here. It is good to see that there are still people who are open to talking with and being with people that are not like themselves. It's a great point, Shabria. So here is this is what we're looking at this week, and then we have exam 3 preview, which we're going to go over that in a second. But is there anything, Shabria, that you'd like to talk about or ask me about with what you've seen so far, or what you're seeing in the slides and the notes?
Okay, so the rivers all converge that they go and do that, for, what's it called again? I forget the name of it.
The Kumbh Mela. Kumbh
And
Mela. Yeah.
they do that Kumbh Mela every 12 or 6 years. And is it in 2 different places each year?
They usually do it. The big one is it's every 12 years. And there's another one that's like every 36 years or something, but usually they do it every year. But every year. Every year. And every 6th and 12 years is like a special one.
Okay.
So it's like an anniversary every year, but then you have the 12-year anniversary, because the story is the gods and the demons were fighting over it and took 12 years to do, or 12 centuries or something. And that drop spilled and it took 12 years to do it. So they do it every 12 years. This is the big one.
So the Invisible River, was that once a river that actually was there, or has it just always been an invisible river?
It's always been an invisible river.
Okay, just checking.
Yeah, I know. I understand. So what we're looking at here is the confluence of the 2 of these major rivers, and one of them is actually not the Ganges yet. It turns into the Ganges. But as we zoom in, Allahabad, you can see here, all along the river's coast, there's plenty of space for all of these pilgrims to come and bathe in the waters. Okay. I would love to see a satellite. I mean, we do have some of them, you'll look it up, but I'd love to see a satellite picture of, there it is right there, this Kumbh Mela area. So this huge area is filled with people. Absolutely. Let's go to see if they have a January one. Okay. You can see it's all smoky. You can see the millions of people here, everywhere. Maybe not that one. It's all, look at that. They've even covered it. It's a little harder to see. I'm trying to get a January one because they usually do it in January and February. Okay, so that's 2018. Okay, so you can see all the boats that take people out to the river to go bathe. And you see all the sediment being kicked up by the people going in the water. Okay, but this is where you have the Kumbh Mela festival in this region right here. And I'm not sure where the spiritual holy river is, but it's somewhere in here. Yeah. So this is, I'm looking at Google Earth, and there's a tool in Google Earth called the Time Machine. You can go back, and obviously the further back you go, the worse the pictures are. Okay, but a January one would be really cool to see, because there'd be people everywhere. And you got to remember, January is pretty darn cold here in northern India. Right? February is the closest we can get to here. But you can see all the boats going in the water, all the people along the sideline. So you still have pilgrims coming here to this big giant festival, and you can see now it's winding down, but you still see people and tents and stuff like that all throughout this area. And then it disappears. So that'd be a good one to see. There's January 1st. It's a little early, but you can see all the boats and all the pilgrims coming in there. This is a huge event. The whole coastline is taken up by boats. And then the pilgrims would stay in it's like a big gigantic city that pops up every year. Wow, that's pretty cool. But supposedly every 12 years is the big one. And you have different, let's see, this one says equivalent to 12 human years, but I've seen them where it goes 6 years and 24 years and a big long one where it's some events. So see, every 64 years, there's a more massive one. So the largest gathering on the planet is here in India. Just like the largest migration of people happens during the Lunar New Year in China, where millions and millions and millions of people are on the move. So it's really hard to fathom. You take Thanksgiving like we're having this week, and you multiply it by 4, because that's the size of China versus the US. And then you multiply it by 5 because it's every single holiday all wrapped into that 1 week. So everyone takes off in India and I'm sorry, Asia, China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, stuff like that. So you can see some of these satellite pictures in the slides showing you all the people in the water, all the sediment that's kicked up from that.
I'm going to have to look on that daily overview and see if you can see it on there.
Oh, yeah.
There's something, those satellite images and stuff they have for that.
So where do you find that?
It's www.overview.com. Trying to do multiple screens here. No, that's not it. Let me.
Okay, so where's Darren? There's Darren. So there's Allahabad, which is the center of the Kumbh Mela festival, the yearly and then every 12 years sort of big gigantic religious festival, biggest migration, biggest gathering of people on the planet. And you can see here off the Himalayas, these major rivers flow downstream, pulling all that snow melt and rain water down the streams, flooding the low and making this one of the most productive agricultural places on the planet, the Ganga River Plain. See all that stuff coming off the mountains. And what happens is these rivers, there's so much sediment in there that when it becomes a little bit drier, it can't fill up the whole channel, so it does all these braided stream type of things. Okay, but in their summertime, when it pours like crazy, these rivers overflow their banks. You can see there's a river that used to be over this way. It brings tons of sediment downstream, depositing it, and then you get these big cities like Dhaka, which are built on floodplain stuff, so there's not many bridges because you can't go deep down into the ground to put pylons in if the ground is all sand. So it's very hard to build bridges. You see there's not many bridges at all here. It's all ferry boat. So right along the edge here, we have, this is what's it called, Bangladesh. And there's the famous city of Calcutta, used the old terminology, but now it's called Kolkata, back to the Indian dialect. And this is one of the biggest cities on the planet. Slums all over the place, beautiful parts of the city all over the place. It's really great and terrible and crazy. Famous for the famous Westerner, Mother Teresa, worked and lived in Kolkata for years and years and years. So you can see all of this sediment coming down from the Himalaya Mountains. So the Himalaya Mountains are being pushed up by plate tectonics, chapter 2, and then all of the rain and the snow wash away that dirt and rock downstream. Where it slows down, you produce this big gigantic floodplain, which we call the country of Bangladesh. Let's put a border on there. So there's Bangladesh right here. It's full of sand and sediment. This is called a river delta. A delta is where the river almost hits the ocean floor and then it spreads out because it tries an easier way to the surface, to the ocean. So it has all these distributaries of water channels that are trying to get to the ocean, trying to get to the fastest way possible. So this dark green zone is actually a Cypress National Park. Let's see if that comes up here. That's just US. So here's the Sundarban, and then the Sundarbans National Park in India. This one is in Bangladesh. This is the last gigantic natural mangrove and ecological preserve. This is where the tigers live. Well, not the tigers, there's tigers everywhere, but you can see how thick this is with jungle-like vegetation. Okay. So that's your trip from the Himalayas downstream. The water rolls downhill into the Ganga River plain, the Ganges, the Ganga River plain, and then down out to the Bay of Bengal. The other river that comes around is the Brahmaputra. That also drains the Tibetan Plateau all the way around to the east and all the way back down to Dhaka. Let me take these plate boundaries off. That makes it look a little better. What's in red? I wonder what red is. I'm trying to look on this GIS here and it's not showing it. Okay. Anyway, does that help you a little bit, Shibria? See, it's red also. International borders. Maybe that's disputed territory. Yeah, it's disputed territory. Between China and India, India and Pakistan, back and forth, Bhutan and China, all sorts of stuff. So Darren, you okay?
Yeah,
Okay, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
no problem.
All right. Other things you want to ask about, Shibria or Darren?
Okay, so since we're talking about India and all, my family's from India,
Mhm.
and so I wanted to know more about Kerala because my family is from there.
From where?
Kerala,
Okay, let me look that up. Spell that for me.
Kerala.
Kerala, India. Okay. Gujarat, Western India.
Yep.
Okay, search. Oh, the Malabar coast. Excellent. Okay. All right. So Kerala is the city in the southwest corner called the Malabar coast. And you can see here, it is on the lowlands. India is like this big giant triangle. Okay, as you see here, this big giant triangle. Okay. You have river valleys, the Ganges River to the north here. You have the Indus River, which starts in northern India, Pakistan, China, Tibet, and flows down through Pakistan. In the center part of the country, you have this big, gigantic raised plateau. And that plateau is called the, what is that one called? The not the Tibetan Plateau, but the, goodness, it's off the top of my head. I forget it now. The Deccan Plateau, Deccan, the Deccan Plateau. We lost Shibria. The Deccan Plateau is this big volcanic area that right around when the dinosaurs got killed 65 million years ago, give or take, lava was pouring out for millions of years out of this zone of India, and it produced this big, gigantic, triangular shaped wedge. Okay. The current research points to this huge amount of lava over millions of years extruding, changing the atmosphere's temperature, changing the atmosphere's chemistry, putting the large lizards and birds on warning, like putting stress on their ecosystem. And then the meteorite slammed into Mexico and just finished it all off. But it happened during that same time period. So this big, gigantic, triangular plateau is called the Deccan Plateau. And you can see when you go and zoom in here, you see these tiny, thousands of tiny villages filled with people. Okay, big, giant cities like Hyderabad and Bengaluru, Chennai are on the coast here. There's Mumbai, the big city of, used to be called Bombay. But on either side of this giant plateau, we call these mountain zones the Ghats, Ghats. You have the western and the eastern. Okay, what they are, okay, they're big, giant, what is this green stuff? Parks, let me take the parks up at it, yeah, okay. These big, giant mountain chains, and there's these mountains that sort of stick up and catch all the rainfall, just like the Himalayas do. Okay, you can see how tall and imposing they are. But it also leaves a great deal of low-lying area that's great for farming. Okay.
Right.
There's a movie that I watched, something about the pool. I think it's the pool. There's one of these cities right on the coast that's a sort of a tourist city. I can't find it, but anyway, it's down here somewhere. And the pool was a really cool movie. It's all in South Indian dialect. It's a really great one. But you can see here, Kerala is at the base of those Western Ghats. Okay, the mountains right there. And during the summertime, this is an area of the state, of the country, that gets tremendous amounts of rainfall.
Yeah, that's true. We get so much rain around there. And even during that time, it's like, it's not like we normally hear when rain falls, it's kind of cold, right?
Yeah.
There, when rain falls, it's humid.
Yes, it's extremely hot and humid. It's like, it's nasty. I think like Florida, but rain all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So these areas, the Ghats are the big mountain zones, right? Southern Ghats, this section here. But do I have a precipitation? So here you can see the movement of the air flow, the monsoon seasons. Okay. And the monsoon seasons are both wet and dry monsoons, which means there's warm rain, like what Darren's talking about, where the air is sucked up to the ITCZ. We talked about that a couple times this semester already. The ITCZ in the intertropical convergence zone moves further north here. So it sucks up all the moist, hot, humid air from the Indian Ocean and drives it onto the land, where then it rises up when it hits the mountains, those Ghats, and you have a tremendous amount of rainfall along the Western Ghats in the summertime. And of course, the Himalayas as well in the summertime. This is the wet, humid one. the winter time when the ITCZ shifts south into the Indian Ocean, it now pulls air in from Siberia and Tibet, which is cold. As it comes down the slopes, it warms up a little bit. But when you watch those videos, notice that Kumbh Mela is in January and people are breathing. You can see the exhalation of the breath turning into fog and mist right away because it's really cold in January. But Kerala does get a dry season because the winds are now coming across the continent. So it's chilly, right, Darren? Chilly, but maybe not that chilly. Not as cold as up in Delhi, but it's nice and dry and chilly.
Not as cold.
Not as cold. And you can see here the Malabar coast where Kerala is, and the eastern side of the Himalayas in Bangladesh are the areas that get the most rainfall, tremendous amount of rainfall. And they don't have it listed. They don't have the city listed here, but it would be somewhere like Cherajundi, which is all the way to the east here, sort of like that, where the wind, the water turns on for 6 months a year, and then it turns off for 3 months a year, and then between you get a little bit. Okay, this is where you get that immense amount of rainfall. Okay.
It's so like tremendous in rainfall that like there's a bunch amount of flood in the areas.
Mm-hmm.
Like the city in Pala where my family lives in, the city in Pala, like it's very, very floody. Like the last time we went, it was like up to our like stomach.
Goodness, wow.
Yeah, and everybody like is, where is it? No, that's Ambala Para. That's not it.
Okay.
It's I don't know how to say it. It's just Pala. It's just Pala.
Is Pala
Should be somewhere around there.
Okay.
So
I don't know the full.
How are the houses built if it floods so much?
That's a great question.
It's mostly like just it's all crowded. It's like a crowded type of city. Like their houses, it's not like built like our houses here. It's like more congested type of thing.
Are they built on like stilts, like up so they don't flood? Okay.
No, not really.
Okay.
Some are. In some regions, yes. Here's Pala. Is that spelled correctly, Darren?
Yeah.
Does this city look familiar? Along a creek, a river with a football stadium, cricket stadium?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So what I just noticed, we're looking over by, what was the town we were looking at? Kala. What was the town we were just looking at?
Pala.
Pala. What's that one? Okay. What was the town we were looking at?
Pala.
No, before that. Something with a K.
I thought it sounded like Kampala, but
okay.
Ambala Pala, Ambara Pala, or something like that.
Kerala, is that it?
Yeah, there you go.
Kerala, yeah, Kerala. So I wanted to show you this, and this is a great test question to ask. Okay, let me zoom in like this so you can see the 3D a little bit. Where are all the houses, Shabriya?
They're all built up on a hill.
On a hill.
Yeah.
Good, Darren. What's down here in the river valleys?
Those are all like sand, maybe.
Oh, I thought they were growing fields.
They are. Look at the squares. You could tell they're
Okay.
human, right?
Mhm.
So to answer your question, are the houses built on stilts? Yes, some places, but they try and put the houses up in the higher elevation
Genius.
because it does rain for 6 months of the year and these river valleys will get filled.
Okay.
So that's why you don't have any houses in the river valleys because that gets flooded. And it's a perfect place to put your crops because if you lose your crops, it's better than losing your house and your livelihood, life. But yeah, looking at this, knowing how much rain they get, it makes complete sense that they build their houses up on the hillsides and have the low-lying sections where it's all farmland. So that's an adaptation that humans have done in relation to the natural environment. In this case, flooding versus livelihoods. So you want the floodplains to be filled with agricultural areas and the safer places where it does not flood, that's where you put your houses. So that comes off the Ghats. We go down to Pala, way down here, right? Where do we have it? Okay, so Pala is along this river valley here. Okay, coming in, trying to zoom in a little bit so we can see the mountains behind it, but it's not going to work. So you can see this little hill here on the river bank. So the town is on the side that would sort of get flooded, but you're on a hillside, so it's not bad. And you can see it's people everywhere. People everywhere. Okay, so let's zoom in just off the city itself. You can see on the hill slope, there's houses all over the place. I wish we had a little bit more detail, but this is pretty good, to be honest with you. And again, away from the river valley as much as possible because this will flood. There's a bridge. Okay, so you can see it's all green, all farmland, forests, stuff like that, and hill slopes. Of course, that does not look like a safe place to put a house on the side of a hill, especially when it rains 6 months a year. But, you know, you put a house where you can survive and live there. So, Darren, that was really cool telling us about a little bit about what you know about this area.
Yeah.
So there's a movie that I have in the extra credit called The Pool. I forget which city along the coast it is here, but it does show the differences between, you know, different Indian ethnic groups. Because as we've seen in Africa, as we see in North America, there are more than just one type of people living here. It is a huge melting pot. I think there's like hundreds of different languages and dialects in India proper. So the only way to actually run a country that way is to have one language that sort of everybody knows. And what is that language, Darren? What's the one language that people here in Pala can go all the way up to the capital, New Delhi, and communicate with people who are from Lucknow or Lahore, well, it's Pakistan.
Hindi.
Hindi, okay. Hindi is one of them.
There's also Malayalam.
Oh yeah, but what's the one that everyone, what do you learn in school too, and that you're speaking right now?
English.
English, right? So you have Hindi, which is a big uniting language, but it's not the only language they use. I think there's like a half dozen official languages. Is that right, Darren?
Yeah, there's a
At least
lot of languages in there.
a lot of
like,
languages, yeah. But in the government, what they do, it's called lingua franca, Lingua space Franca. And that's the language of business or government. So, Darren, when you were growing up in Pala, what languages did you learn?
Oh wait, I didn't
You
grow
didn't
up
grow up. Your
there.
parents
I
did.
grew I was born in Oman. If
You were
you
born in Oman, which is right over there.
Yeah, I was
If you
born
start.
there, but I was only like 1 year old when I came into US. So I'm
Okay.
not. I grew up here.
You grew up here. So your parents are from Pala?
Yeah, Pala.
Pala.
Yeah,
And what languages do they speak? And
they
what did they
speak.
learn?
Okay. So my sister knows like 7 different languages. My parents know 5 or 6 languages. Same from India. All these, like Malayalam. They know Malayalam, Hindi, a little bit of Tamil. Um, I think they know also like Arabic and everything
Hmm.
too. So yeah,
So let me get out of this thing here, make this picture nice and large. So what Darren is talking about, his family is from this Malayalam. How do you pronounce that? Malayalam?
Malayalam,
Malayalam.
Malayalam.
Okay, so this
Yeah,
region here, so his base language, his family's base language is Dravidian, like the type of language. But as you go down, these are different, these are, the language name is a little different here. So that's Malayalam. Tamil
yeah.
is a big language down here in Sri Lanka and southern India. Okay, so these languages, this language family, Dravidian, is different than the Indo-Aryan, which is mostly Hindi, but you can see there's Punjabi and Gujarati and Marathi and Bengali, Nepalese, right?
Yeah.
These are all different languages.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you deal with Eastern India, you're talking about Tibetan Burman. So when you get together in the capital city of Delhi or New Delhi, you have to get together and talk a language that everyone understands.
So in
And
that area, you would only speak Hindi because nobody else understands what you're saying in Malayalam.
right, so down
Because
here,
we went there.
go ahead, Darren.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we
You're
went
the
there
expert.
before, and we went there before, and we couldn't talk in our native language because nobody else understood. So we had to talk in Hindi. And when we were visiting the Taj Mahal and everything like that.
Okay. So what did your
Yeah,
parents, when they grew up, they learned which languages in
Malayalam.
Malayalam?
Mal- yeah,
Where did they learn English?
they learned English when they only came up here. So they
Okay.
basically when my parents were when my mom was learning nursing, she had to speak English when she is coming here or anywhere else, right? So they had their education in English there.
Where is there?
In in India, in
In India.
Pala, India, somewhere around there. Yeah. And
Where?
then after her nursing, huh? In Pala, still in Kerala.
Oh, Carol, down this way here.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So when you're educated beyond elementary school, you probably get to have experience with different languages, right? Just like here in
Mhm.
elementary school, we just teach English at first, but you can't take Spanish or French until you get to middle school or high school. It's idiotic, but
Yeah.
it's the way it is. Here in India, the subcontinent of India was a colony of the British. So the British set up and redesigned their whole education system for the continent. And it was completely different than what we learned about with sub-Saharan Africa. Here in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the British actually empowered the native populations to be part of the administration. So they taught English in schools in the, you know, the middle and upper class schools in the cities, but they also spread that out to some of the countryside. So what it did, that English united the whole region because they could, you know, someone in your town could speak English and get along with someone, you know, like Darren was saying, when they went to visit Accra, I'm sorry, you had to speak in Hindi because no one would understand them in the Malayalam language. So Hindi was one of them, and then English was another one. That is a big lingua franca, they call it. So because of that British imperialism, you have a lot of people in South Asia that do speak English as a second language, and pretty well for that matter, because they learned it in schools. And again, not all schools, but in many schools. Okay. Any other comments, Darren? Because this is great. What else can you tell us?
There's also what I heard is, I'm not really sure about it, but there is a river in India, somewhere in India, that people go down and worship there, and they think of it as like a blessing or a holy water type of thing. But I'm not really sure which river it is, though. Man.
That is one of the things you'll read about here in our Kumbh Mela festival. It's right there. So
Yeah.
part of the assignment that you have this week is to read about and watch some of the videos. You'll have probably a small essay on there dealing with this. So yeah, that's Allahabad up here to the north, right there.
Yeah.
Okay. Here is the city of Agra, which is famous for what?
The river.
The
Or
river.
Worship river.
Where's the Taj? Agra Fort. Someone here's the Taj Mahal.
I think
somewhere.
yeah.
Is that Agra
It's
or
that
Agra?
one right there. Agra Fort.
Agra Fort. There's the giant. Look at how big that fort is. Okay, it's huge. This whole section there, along the river, of course, to help control the river's transportation and stuff. And then I don't know where there it is. The Taj Mahal is over here, right along the river.
Oh, there we go.
And for some reason, this is not coming up. I don't know why. It says it's clickable, but something's not going on there. So there's the big Taj Mahal. Right there in Agra. So that is not in Delhi, by the way. That's not in Delhi. Let's zoom out. Okay. So there's more than just India in this region here, as you see here. To the northern India, you can see it's starting to go into the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush, which are the mountains up to the north here of Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Hindu Kush mountains there. This region, when the British left in 1947, all heck broke loose because the British sort of controlled this region and used religion to help them control the population. When they left, then you had pretty much pure chaos. They call that the partition. And people swarmed across the border. So anyone who was like Hindi living in the Pakistan region left and went to India because they felt they were not safe because they were Hindi in Pakistani land or Muslim land. And then the Muslims moved into Pakistan away from India because they were afraid of the Hindis taking revenge on them or something like that. So this region to the north, called the Punjabi region, right? Kashmir, no, I'm sorry, not Punjab, Kashmir, Kashmir is this big gigantic river valley of the Indus River and others that is heavily disputed between India and Pakistan. And then China says, you know what, we want some of that too, like this area there. But this is there's Indian controlled Kashmir, there's Pakistani controlled Kashmir. It's this wonderful agricultural rich valley and highlands that is gorgeous, but it's also very heavily disputed. And you can see this wonderful valley right through here that empties out into the Pakistani region here, and then the river valley there. This is the Indus River, one of the heartlands or hearths, cultural hearths of humanity. Okay. When you think of like famous rivers where humanity grew up around, you think of the Nile River, the Indus River, the Ganga River, the Ganges, and then the Yellow River, which is the Huanghe in China, the North China Plateau. And then in the United States, it's the Mississippi River, but the mound builders are there. So these are the big cultural hearths. And you can see here, Pakistan is pretty much a desert, except along the river channel, where they do a lot of irrigation. Okay. And then here's Afghanistan, the home of the world's most, many refugees. It comes from Afghanistan trying to escape the war and stuff like that. So here is the Himalayas, where it turns into the Hindu Kush mountains, right? And these are really, really high and tall mountains. So the Kashmir zone is the one that is being disputed between Pakistan and India. And because it has the water, the importance here is the water, control of water and control of land, territory for farming. But the water is the big thing, because you can't, as your population grows, you need to secure water for them. And this is what China's trying to get in here too. China and India fight over this region once in a while, but they don't do it with guns. They do it with sticks and rocks. I think that's sort of a tradition here because they don't want to escalate it. It's just local fights. So go look that up for extra credit. That's kind of crazy. So you have Pakistan, which is mostly Muslim population. You have India, which has 1.3 billion people and almost, almost 300 or 350,000 of them are Muslims. You have Bangladesh, which is mostly Muslim. India is mostly Hindi, and others, but mostly Hindu. And then Nepal and Bhutan, these are more Buddhist in nature, and they tend to be a little more isolated, obviously, than India does. And then here is Mount Everest, the highest point on the planet, 29,029 feet above sea level as of this decade. Next decade, it might be a foot higher. So, and then finally, Bangladesh. Here's eastern India that stretches all the way along the Brahmaputra River, all the way around. And then Bangladesh is flat as the floor, we call it, because it's mostly sediment piled down from the Himalayas. And this is the area that gets hit really, really hard with some cyclones, hurricanes, cyclones. Because cyclones form in this warm ocean water that we learned about already. And then as it moves up, there's really nowhere for the water to go but inland, because it's funneling all that wind straight into the river valleys of India and Bangladesh. Plus all the rain that falls on the mountains comes downhill, meeting the big storms coming onshore, and you have water going everywhere sideways. And you get tremendous amount of flooding. In 1971 or 72, they had this gigantic cyclone that killed 250,000 people. So I think the Beatles were really popular right around then, and George Harrison, one of the Beatles, put on one of the first benefit concerts So it's like a big benefit concert, and a lot of the money went to the 250,000 people who were killed and families displaced here. So to the south, you have the teardrop island of Sri Lanka. Finally, after almost 30 years of civil war, there's now peace breaking out. And you can see how close it is to Darren's family's side on the Ghats. Okay. And then you have right here the Maldives, which are a bunch of islands that are barely over the sea level. They're mostly atolls, call them atolls. There's a little town right on one of these little island atolls. That is packed with people, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And there's your airstrip right there. But these islands are no more than like 10 or 15 feet above sea level. You can see I'm on this island right there. It's 24 feet above sea level, which a nice hurricane or cyclone will wash over with the storm surge.
I thought those were reefs or something.
They are reefs. These are
Okay.
coral reefs. These are coral reefs that are sticking up above the ocean.
Okay.
Yeah. These features are called atolls, ATOLLS, where there's usually a volcano underneath the ocean in the center, where it's sunk below the sea, and then the coral reef, which is living, still sticks near the surface where the sun is. It's really cool. But this stretches all the way down south along this Indian ridge. You can see this ridge underneath, all the way down to Diego Garcia, which is somewhere down here, and they won't even show you it. It's somewhere over here. Diego Garcia is this military outpost. Is that it? Nope. It's a tiny little island, British and English or American. I was close. So there's Diego Garcia, military base. You're not allowed anywhere near it if you're a private sailor. They'll come and apprehend you and then bring you ashore and say, what are you doing here? And then go away, stuff like that. But that's a military base back in the old days when you needed coal to cross the ocean. So that was a place where they put coal reserves so the British ships could fuel up again. But now it's a big communication satellite, communication place right now between the British and the Americans. That's Diego Garcia. All right, so we're just about done in this with what I want to cover, but there's also a lot more stuff here if you want to learn about it. Like there's the partition and there's the diaspora we talked about earlier. Okay, the languages are just tremendously diverse. The religions, as we talked about, it's not just two religions here. You have Hinduism, which is and again, when you see these colors, it's not like every single person in here is the yellow Hindu, right? It's the majority. So there's Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, which is a little bit of both mixed together. Okay, they like to say it's the best of both worlds, right? You have Buddhism, which is further to the north, along the Himalayas. You have Jainism, which is down east towards west towards Gujarat, and the others like Zoroastrianism, which is down by the southwest corner by Pala. Pockets of Christianity from colonies remain. You have these Austro-Asiatic tribal languages here. This is language, but these are, it's a big, diverse, what is this? This is, yeah, a big, diverse group of religions here.
So how many different, going back to the pilgrimage of that, there were how many sects of different people that came to that? Were they all just Hindu, or were they some other people that were in?
Oh, the diaspora, people leaving?
Well, no, how many people went to the religious ceremony in the?
Alaban?
Yes.
Yeah, anywhere. I've read that in one day, there were like 10 million bathers on one single day. And over the course of the festival, I think it was a 35 or 40-day festival, you had upwards of almost 90 million people showing up.
And now all of those people all believe in one religion, but it's separate?
It's Hindu. Yeah, it's Hindu, but there's different sects of Hinduism. Just like Christianity, you have Lutheranism, you have Catholicism, you have Southern Baptist, you have Reformed Baptist, you have Seventh-day Adventist. So you have all these different sects of Christianity. You have all these different sects of Hinduism.
And they all line up according to their sect, and each sect goes in a specific order?
No, I think they go geographically. So everyone who is this sort of sect goes to this portion of the town, and they go into this section of the river. So I think they do it that way. But again, I haven't been there, so I haven't really seen it. I've read about it, but the logistics are unfathomable to deal with 90 million people over a month and a half, getting them on trains and make sure they're fed and make sure diseases don't run through there and make sure everyone's warm enough and make sure everyone's inoculated and disease, it's just terrible things to think about. But yeah, and they do it every year.
Yeah, my father-in-law's cousin is it takes place in that, I guess. They were talking about it, and they were and they are white. They're actually live in Australia, I believe. Or New Zealand? New Zealand. They live in New Zealand, and they worship Kali. Sorry, that's what we named our daughter too, was Kali. That.
Oh, cool.
After that Hindu goddess.
That's pretty cool.
I was just trying to figure it out because I don't understand their religions, but I understand that goddess, and I thought she was pretty cool.
That is cool. So to go along with that, and just to reinforce what this map is showing you, when you look at these colors, it does not mean that it's 100% Hindu or Islam or Christian. Okay, these are majority areas. You can see areas that are mixed together, and for so long, I mean, there is some prejudice between back and forth, but in general, from what I've read for almost 25 years about this, people get along pretty well. It's just when you deal with government and favoritism with money, that's when people start getting offended and mad, and why is he getting something when I'm not? And jealousy and also fairness comes to play. But between families, between people get along fine. And again, you got to remember that not everyone in Pakistan is Muslim. Okay, not everyone in the yellow area in India is Hindu. Right? And not everyone in the purple zone is Buddhist. So you got to remember that people live all over the place. They interact all the time. That's what makes our world so cool. So Darren, you can see from where your family is from, it's a mixture of Christianity, Islam, Hinduism. We had another color in there. 1, 2, 3, right there. And then look at Sri Lanka, how Buddhist it is. And the next place is right on shore, but then you have to go all the way to the core, which is the mountains. Okay, let me zoom back out here. Okay, other things, there's the diaspora, there's the movie, the cultural stuff we're doing our readings on. You can see the movement of people all over the world, including Tobago or Trinidad, I forget which one. There's Fiji, all the way in the United States and Europe. There's the Persian Gulf area that Darren was talking about earlier, like Oman. So you have a lot of people all over the planet. There's your history. There's Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers, and Mao. Geopolitics, all sorts of cool stuff. There's your data. Okay. Again, India. Where's India? There's no population numbers here, but India is the largest, or now it's the second largest, but soon to be the largest country in the world in terms of population. The Human Development Index, the underage mortality is really high all over the place. And you can see how much it's dropped in 25 years. Okay, I mean, that's an amazing stat, dropping from 1990, where for every 1,000 children that are born, 139 die before they reach 5 years old. And then that is now 38 out of 1,000. Tremendous amount of growth. And that's mainly because of access to medicine and access to food. That's really, really helped. And the literacy rates are pretty high. The gender inequality index is still middle of the road. But it could be better, but it could be a lot worse. Okay, the poorest world region next to sub-Saharan Africa. Economic disparity, so some people are really rich, just like the US. Some people are really poor, just like the US. All sorts of export stuff, economic differences, centers of growth. We have internet is pretty big, obviously. With the education system outsourcing, there's TV shows, there's movies about outsourcing from the mid 2000s. There's a TV show and movie. Females are having a really hard time with this current government in India, where the government's trying to take away more and more female rights, and they're fighting back, of course. Part of that is culture, part of that is history. And part of that is also the female seeing with, having the world in your hand, like your phone. You can now see what's going on outside of your territory. And you can see people and women going to school and learning. And the Indian women are going, why can't we do that? So there's a little bit of push. And of course, the male-powered government and society that we have pushes back. But we don't know anything about that stuff here in the United States, do we? Nothing like that here happens. So anyway, that's the general consensus. Any questions you might need, anything here, please let's ask about it and talk about it. Our next